Welcome everyone to this event on EU migration and asylum policy. My name is Saila Heinikoski and I work as a senior research fellow at the European Union Research Programme at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I'm really happy to see so many people live here today and many more following the event online. And before I give the floor to our excellent speakers today, let me say a few words about this event. So the seminar is organized together with the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, TEPSA, in the framework of the project DICE, Differentiation, Clustering, Excellence, which has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. And the project's aim is to disseminate the results of 3 EU-funded research projects on differentiated integration, which refers to the development where not all member states participate in all EU policies at the same time, or non-EU countries may be involved in some EU policies. And a good example of this differentiation is the field of borders and migration that we will discuss here today, where not all member states belong to the Schengen area. Some Schengen countries are non-EU states. Then we have Denmark with an opt-out from migration and other justice and home affairs policies, and Ireland has the possibility to opt in or out in EU policies in this field. So this project's aim is to ensure that all this state-of-the-art research on differentiation is translated into policy and advice and made accessible at the European, national and regional levels. And this is one of the events serving that purpose also. And differentiation is also related to the current refugee situation, with millions of people fleeing the war in Ukraine. In 2015, instead, member states were unable to agree on the sharing of responsibility. Several countries reintroduced internal border control that countries continue until today. And member states have still not been able to agree on the Commission's proposals for new migration and asylum policy, which were published already in September 2020. But after the Russian attack in Ukraine, we have seen a very united union welcoming refugees from Ukraine in all the member states. In addition, a Temporary Protection Directive from 2001 was activated for the first time and providing immediate protection for those fleeing Ukraine in most European countries. Denmark's not formally involved due to the opt-out that I mentioned, but does provide this corresponding protection. And in this seminar, we are going to discuss whether the Union's migration and asylum policies currently going with different perspectives and excellent speakers representing ministries, EU institutions and agencies and migration experts. So we are honored to have first 3 addresses from the Finnish Ministry of the Interior, the European Commission's Directorate General for Migration and Home Affairs, and the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, Frontex. And after that, we will hear 2 comments from experts in EU migration and asylum policy. And after these addresses, we will move on to a panel discussion, which will be moderated by EU program leader at FIIA, Juha Jokela. And it will be possible for the audience to ask questions during the panel debate. You can post questions online in the stream service during the addresses already, and then also the audience can ask questions in the room. So I will briefly introduce each speaker at their turn, but first we have a representative from the Finnish Ministry of Interior Affairs. We had a small change in the program as the Kirsi Pimja was not able to come, but we are very delighted to have Minna Hulkkonen, Director General from the Migration Department at the Finnish Ministry of the Interior. And you can perhaps provide Finnish perspective to the current developments in the EU migration and asylum field. So please, your floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for organizing this very interesting event. And I'm trying to take up only a few points of, I guess, common interest about the migration package, how it looks like at the moment, what are the Finnish views, positions, then few words about the Ukraine situation, how it looks here in Finland, and then perhaps very initial thoughts, how we what is the future, perhaps, or where we are going on this migration field. So, as we all know, the reform of asylum system in European Union is not the negotiations are not finished or not even near there. So, Commission proposed a new package 2020, and it reflected the reality that any mandatory distribution of asylum seekers was not going to be politically feasible. Instead, solidarity would have to be flexible. And I guess that this is one of the key issues of the whole question about the migration package, the solidarity, commitment, and the trust between the member states. This Commission approach has clear merit, as also circumstances and needs are different from one crisis to another. What matters is that member states commit to help each other and ensure the functioning of the common system. This is more important than ever from the Finnish perspective, with more than 1,300 kilometers of external border in the changed security situation, as we have noticed. The French Council Presidency is now working very hard to get some headway in the reform before the summer break. Finland has consistently supported innovative ways forward. Many of the proposals are almost ready to be adopted, and this work should not go to waste. The adoption of the Asylum Agency regulation last year was an important step forward, and the stronger mandate of the agency will now come to good use. We have also done some good progress also on negotiating on Eurodac proposal, which is the European-wide information exchange system, and also on screening proposal. Screening is something that we are screening is something that we are doing on the borders, and I guess that Mr. Laukkanhuhta will talk more about that. When we say that Finland has been ready to find out innovative solutions to find the compromises, so that really means that we have shown quite a lot of flexibility. So we have seen that many of the member states have been of the opinion that we need to negotiate on the migration package as a whole package. For us, for Finland, we've been ready to go to show flexibility, to go forward by step, to accept one instrument after another instrument. For us, the progress is really what we are looking for, and we very much hope that we will be able to show that flexibility also now in June's Council, and when we see the proposal of the French presidency. A comprehensive migration and asylum policy will be one of the keys for a successful European Union in the coming years and decades, and this seems to be clear for us, everyone. Tailored partnerships with the third countries are being built to make progress in areas such as return and readmission, as well as legal pathways. The Commission recent skills and talent package is a priority initiative for Finland. And here I must say that it seems that we concentrate too much only on asylum procedure and on asylum system. On the other hand, we must remember that many of those who are actually coming through the asylum system to the European Union area are actually coming here to look for a job, to work here. And if we want really to make the asylum system to work, so we should also provide at the same time functioning legal pathways to come to work in European Union. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to work too much on that sector. We have been only concentrated on the asylum system and then perhaps on illegal immigration and trafficking, which all are very important topics. But at the same time, and specifically if we are looking towards the future, we need workers inside the European Union. So it should be also the time for the European Union to start to work with this legal migration package. But our steps have been very small until now. So then just a few words about the hybrid attacks. The newer threat of using migration as a tool for hybrid influencing is one more reason why the EU needs solid asylum procedures that work in all situations. As you know, the debate on the matter has been quite intense in Finland, if you've been following the discussion. So from my perspective, it seems that the only discussion what comes up in the Parliament's discussion hour on Thursday evening is this hybrid attack and how the Finland is prepared to work in situation like that. To me, it is clear that if member states are united, decisive and fair in their migration asylum policy, it is much less tempting for foreign powers to try to instrumentalize migration for political purposes. And I think that is very, very important to keep in mind, and the European values and specifically the principles of the EU asylum law and the internal agreements are really those that we should stick in these very difficult times. So then few words about the Ukraine and the Russians' aggression war there. Due to the situation in Ukraine and its migratory consequences, the swift activation of the Temporary Protection Directive was EU at its most unified and determined. This tool gives member states the opportunity to welcome those fleeing the war without lengthy procedures. The spirit of solidarity has been remarkable, never seen before in the migration negotiation in Brussels, really. The refugee situation is, of course, unique. The atrocities of war are all around daily news in member states, and the fleeing people, women, children, the elderly, are particularly vulnerable. The big question is what impact the Ukrainian situation will have on the prospects of advancing the asylum reform. The map of migratory pressures in the Union has been partly reversed. While of course the traditional Mediterranean routes are still active as well, even more so as the summer approaches. What Finland hopes to see is an increased awareness among the member states of what it means to face pressure and what kind of support the EU should provide. This could then lead to options moving closer together. Of course, there are also less optimistic scenarios. It is telling that most member states bordering Ukraine, regardless of high numbers of arrivals, have been careful not to request an EU-wide distribution mechanism of those fleeing Ukraine. And that, I think, is quite remarkable. This probably means that they intend to stick to their previous resistance regarding such mechanism in the asylum reform. Also, more generally, with many member states' reception systems under strain, it can be more difficult to find participants in solidarity measures. And we know there will be demand for these measures as the numbers of arrivals grow in the Mediterranean. It is hard to imagine moving forward in the reform if only a handful of member states are willing to commit to relocation of asylum seekers. Finland has participated in voluntary relocation in recent past. We will see what the government decides as next step in this regard. What I know for sure is that Finland continues to work decisively for a European solution. And for what I know is also that in this French presidency proposal for the declaration in June's Council, this solidarity plays a key role. So if we want to make make progress in the migration package, again, we need solidarity. And it will be very interesting to see how the member states are acting then in June's Council. Finally, in the invitation for this event, the question was posed about differentiated EU integration in the field of migration and asylum. I am sure this question has crossed the minds of many during the thought negotiation of past years. However, I think there is still a strong willingness to act as one Europe in these matters that are so crucial to our common future. Of course, there is also room for tailor-made regional approaches and closer cooperation between interested member states on targeted topics. These do not rule each other out. One example where some member states are more advanced than others are voluntary return and reintegration programs. Innovation and good practices have to start somewhere so that they can spread gradually to the whole EU. But as long as we wish to hold on to the Schengen area of free movement, and we certainly in Finland, we do want that, we need a common asylum system where standards are equal and people do not have to move around in masses in search for a fair process or reasonable integration prospects. We also need the broad EU shoulders to take up the opportunities and challenges linked to the migration globally in close cooperation with international partners. Thank you. I think I leave it here and be ready then for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General Minna Hulkkonen, for your address. It was very interesting to hear the Finnish aspect to the current developments and EU proposals. And now we have the honor to hear the views from the Commission. We have a remote connection to the Deputy Head of Unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for Migration and Home Affairs, Cecilia Verkley. So Cecilia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, many thanks, first of all, for the invitation. And I'd like to send warm greetings from Michael Schotter, our director, who would have been with you today, either remotely or in person. But the situation in Ukraine requests him to be at other meetings, unfortunately. As mentioned, I'm the Deputy Head of Unit of the Asylum Unit in the Directorate General for Home Affairs. And together with Mr. Schotter and my Head of Unit, we have been at the forefront of activating the Temporary Protection Directive. We have been working long hours to actually prepare the Commission decision and to make sure, together with the Member States, that this instrument was adopted very quickly by the Council. And we are very, very grateful for the very cooperative support by the Member States. As was mentioned earlier, we have never seen such a signal of unity towards the end of the Council meeting when the Council implementing decision was adopted. That was very, very heartening. And it says something, I would say, about the impact of this crisis has on all of us. I will address that element later on, but I think it's an important element to bear in mind when we compare this situation to other asylum and migration crises. I'm also overseeing in the unit the work of the asylum agency, and I share also the very positive message sent earlier on that the new regulation was adopted last year. We thought that was the beginning of a good process, hoping that this will lead to an adoption of also the other proposals under the Pact for Migration and Asylum. On the Temporary Protection Directive, which has kept us very busy ever since the invasion and continues to keep us busy probably for some time to come, it is interesting to note that this was a kind of dormant beauty laying around since 2001 and never used, and which I think upon its activation has shown that it requires the engagement of a very wide range of actors, and not in the least also local actors who have to engage in making the directive work. But not only within the European Union, we have also seen quite some engagements when it comes to very practical supports from countries like the US and Canada. And even the Western Balkan countries have enacted legislation which is very close to what the Council implementing decision does. And we have seen the same for countries like Norway and also Denmark. So in a sense, we have seen a wave of support and solidarity which went well beyond the European Union. In our daily work, we noticed that we are discovering the potential as well as the challenges of the directive as we go along. As I said, we never used it, and of course we did not have the time to consider any impact assessment to understand what the activation of the directive would mean. So we have now discovered that all along the road with many actors. I think what is important to understand, and this will inevitably have an impact also on the way we will assess later on how the directive has been used. The directive establishes a minimum requirement, so inevitably there will be differences in the way the member states will apply the various obligations and provide the various rights to the beneficiaries of temporary protection. We have from the very beginning said that although these are indeed minimum requirements, it would be good if the member states engage from the beginning also in a kind of process of peer review, so that they understand how each of them aims to implement all these requirements, so that they can learn from each other. And also what we thought it was important to mention to the member states, that if they see an issue with implementing the directive, in particular to those people who fled Ukraine a couple of days before the 24th of February, the day of the invasion, that they can be more generous. Minimum requirements means that you can be more generous towards people who knock on your door. And we have already seen some occasions where member states indeed apply this approach. What we have noticed so far are that there are considerable challenges in a number of areas. We have seen it notably in the area of registration. Of course, when large numbers of people come in, and certainly in the first 2 to 3 weeks, the numbers were very high, that was a challenge for the member state to actually register all these people. And up till now, I think maybe half of those who are now on European territory have been registered. So there remains still a considerable backlog in terms of registration. What we also learned is that some people are afraid to register themselves because they think if they are registered, they cannot go back to Ukraine, be it, for example, to check upon family or to go back and get some documents which they need in Europe. So there is also unclarity with people what are the benefits of such a registration. Another challenge, and there I think we should be very grateful, in particular to all the municipalities, but also to private persons, that's accommodation. Of course, none of the member states had any public accommodation available in the numbers we needed. And I think there we have seen an enormous and very heartening wave of solidarity. But another issue which remains, I would say, a daily challenge is the need for information, the need for coordination also. I want to give you a couple of examples to understand what we are discovering all along the way. Our unit is setting up a registration platform. The member states register the people in their national databases, but when somebody knocks on their door and requires the temporary protection, they also want to know, certainly now after some time, we are now almost 3 months into the crisis, then the member states want to know whether that person has obtained temporary protection already in another member state. But there is no European database where they can actually compare the data. So we are now setting up an IT platform, not very sophisticated, because we have to do it on the basis of what exists. We do not have time to invent anything new, where they can upload the data they have registered so far and where they can check if they have a registration, if a person is already a beneficiary in another member state. It does not mean that the person cannot move around between member states. That is still possible, but we want to avoid that persons will benefit from more than one member state, because that is not the idea underpinning the directive. It can also be used for family reunification. So if in the database one finds out that there are people under a similar name, but maybe they find themselves in different member states, the tool can also be used to facilitate this. Another example, we have launched last Monday a phone helpline, because, as I said, the need for information continues to be very, very important, and in particular for accurate information. And last but not least, we have a very dedicated website, or even websites, where people can check on all the information available at member state level. And I also want to mention briefly, but that is something, the kind of support which is not always very visible. The Commission has already granted 3.5 billion euro to the frontline member states to meet their first financial needs, which will be quite considerable. I think we all have only seen the beginning yet. I'd like to thank the organizers in particular for the issues which they have put on the agenda today. And when I looked at them, I had the impression you had read our minds. Because for a short while, we have been contemplating amongst ourselves what could be the impact of the use of the Temporary Protection Directive for the discussions on the Pact, but also, I think, for the wider thinking on migration and asylum. Now, we all know that the aim of the directive is to avoid that the national asylum systems of the member states crash. But there is another important aim of the directive, and the directive, being of 2001, uses a bit of its own language. It reflects, in fact, or it mentions that an important aim is to ensure that the member states, by applying the instrument, achieve what it calls a balance of efforts. A balance of efforts is, in fact, what we call nowadays solidarity. And I fully agree with the previous speaker that the solidarity is increasingly a key point in this whole crisis. And hopefully it will become such an important point, and hopefully the member states will learn that much from the way they will apply this directive, both to the beneficiaries, but also in the way they work together to make this whole process a success at the end of the day, that this will be a positive side effect of this very unfortunate and sad crisis. So solidarity is also very much at the forefront of our communication, and that's why when we started to coordinate the roles of the member states, we did so and still do so by way of what we call a solidarity platform. Again, to show very clearly that is a key element of this whole process, and it is in fact a key element of the whole pact. So our initial thinking in terms of what means this whole crisis for the pact and for the future of migration and asylum, it may well on the ground allow the member states to get a much clearer idea of what solidarity actually means and how it works and how it can benefit people even in large numbers, or later on, maybe when the crisis is over, in numbers which may become a bit more normal. But having said that, at this stage, of course, I think we all would like to get an even better picture of what the impact could be on our asylum policies, in particular on the key question, which is also asked by the organizers, about a uniform system, or the extent to which there should be given some leeway to member states to look for certain alternatives within the general framework. And as we go along and as we see much more how the situation unfolds, I'd like to say that this seems to be a rather unique situation, which may not be easily comparable with what we saw in 2015 with Syria. Needless to say that when you read the press, you notice that there was much wider geographical implications. This does not only touch the Ukraine, it touches our frontline member states, but it touches also the whole of the EU, and it touches beyond, looking also at the impact it has on NATO. It also goes beyond migration and asylum, because this is an international crisis that has major implications for energy, and also major implications for food supply. And we already see the very unfortunate adverse effects in African countries where food prices are rising, and which has very, very negative effects already also on young children. And last but not least, and I'd like to end with this, what we noticed also within our own unit, but also within our own communities where we live, is that this war, this invasion into Ukraine, has generated a lot of emotions with people, not only with generations who never experienced war, but certainly even more with those who still have memories, or even vivid memories, of past conflicts. And in that sense, I think we probably feel very, very close to what Ukraine is going through, which I think to some extent, so beyond the fact that this has major implications beyond the EU, but that also explains why we have seen this wave of solidarity, which still continues to be the case. We weren't sure if after 2 or 3 months the engagement, either at the level of member states, but also local communities, private persons, would still be as important as it was in the early days. But we still see quite the same level of engagement. So there is something going on here which looks like not only Ukraine is fighting Russia, but that we, with different means, are fighting alongside this country. And happy to take any questions, and also to participate later on in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia Verkley. That was very interesting, and I'm very happy to hear that this event is also useful for the Commission's discussions for the future of EU migration and asylum policy. And now we heard a bit of this Commission's policy views, and now we have the honor to hear the views from the Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, where we have Kari Loukkaanhuhta, who works as the head of Coast Guard and Law Enforcement Unit at the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. So please, Kari, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and my pleasure to be here to offer also an operational perspective on this, although I understand that the main theme for today is migration policy, which of course border policies, border management is a quite integral tool to manage this. And in this respect, when I started preparing my short intervention, I was looking at the questions and thinking that okay, what are the similarities or differences in 2015 migration crisis? And there are, of course, few obvious differences. First of all, geography, that we have a war in the neighboring country of the European Union member state, and the people are fleeing. Actually, bombs are flying, and they are fleeing to safety. Whereas in 2015, as it was mentioned by the previous speakers, that it was not so directly linked to the conflict in Syria, for example, but the people had been already provided protection, for example, more than 2 million in Turkey, and then no prospect of going back, and then might be more like so-called mixed migration flows when they decided to move towards Europe, and of course with elements of instrumentalization by some actors in this respect. So the geography was one. Then the sheer numbers, we had 1.5 million 2015, 2016, and now already more than 6 million has left Ukraine, although about a couple of million has already returned back there. So this is the one. Then for us, for border management and border control and law enforcement authorities, the big difference is, of course, the composition of these groups. That more than 90% of people fleeing from Ukraine are women and children. So almost all of them are vulnerable groups, which of course gives the big opportunity for any kind of risk and criminal groups to take advantage of this, as we have already indications of they activated their networks immediately. Mainly, of course, trafficking of human beings, child abuse, and so forth. And for the past of this conflict, for us, it is a very important element is also the weapons issue there. Now, basically, every Ukrainian have access to weapons, and we consider that this can become a new Yugoslavia in a sense that after the conflict starts over, there are a huge amount of weapons in the market which can be benefited, and our first indications are already that these weapons are not part of the conflict, but they are also transported back and outside from Ukraine. The other difference, which was mentioned by the previous speakers, is this because of the sheer mass, and also it's a flip side or the other side of the coin of this great solidarity what member states have been showing in accommodating and accepting these refugees, as was again mentioned by the previous speakers, that this temporary protection which has been offered and the humanitarian corridors, that is that the people are moving to member states and to EU without registration, for example, as we heard from the Commission intervention. Whereas in 2015, the attempt was that all those who come across the border, they will be part of screening and identification, and their biometrics and they are done. So we try to know who is here in Europe, and they are identifiable, even though if they would apply, move on to the European other member states and then try to register themselves under different name, for example, which in this case, when the documentation or the identification is not sure, it's a bit different than registration. You can register yourself under any kind of name, but you need to be also identified as an individual. So that is also one element from the border. So in this respect, those are the, let's say, obvious differences and the risks what we see and what we as an operational actors try to address since the first wave of people started to come. We know that there's DHB, trafficking human beings, organized groups were already immediately active. They're offering accommodation, travel, and work to those people fleeing with a false pretext, and then eventually turning out to be DHB victims. And what is Frontex role in all this? Is that Frontex as a European Border and Coast Guard agency is the other part of the European Border and Coast Guard, which is member states are responsible of their border sectors, and Frontex has the obligation to support member states in risk. So it's a shared responsibility of the external borders. Although we had already so-called joint operations along the eastern land border before the crisis, and during the, let's say, the crisis with Belarus and the instrumentalization, then this came on top of this, and we were happy to see the operational solidarity of the member states that they were offering. We are still relying much of our operations, the human resources, from the member states. And when we had to make extra calls for member states that we want to support the member states neighboring Ukraine, and then eventually when Commission in record time negotiated the status agreement, which allowed us to also to do similar operation in Moldova, that member states were offering these resources, and we have more than 300 people now working there, supporting Moldovans and the EU member states in this respect. The other element of Frontex which supports is a return activities, which is the other part of the other end of the cycle of migration management, that who are coming, you have right justified, they have been identified and then addressed to the proper asylum process, and then after the asylum process, indicate those persons who do not be granted will be returned. But the part of this is voluntary returns, which Frontex has now so far been supporting member states, but we are still talking about very low numbers and then most of them are those third country nationals who are non-Ukrainians who were working in Ukraine before the conflict started, and then they are still small part, but in some quite significant numbers also who came to Europe, and then some of them just wanted to return to their countries and so forth. So this is another element from our side. And I think differentiation or unity, I think that operationally, I would say we had quite unity in the member states offering their support. Differentiation, I would say it's more on the migration policy side, how to do this burden sharing as has been attempted years now by the Commission, but I leave this to the other participants to debate and argue. But I'm happy to answer any questions. Already, I mentioned the moderator that I have a time schedule so tight that I might need to leave a little bit earlier today. So it's not a demonstration; it's just a flight to catch. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Kari Loukkaanhuhti, for your address. We do understand this is a very busy time for anyone working in this field. And now after these speakers, we have the pleasure to hear from two migration policy experts. And let me first invite here Jolanta Szymanska from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And she works at the head of the European Union program there and is an expert in EU migration and asylum policy. So we're very happy to hear your comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Say, for inviting me for this event. Maybe I will start my comment by saying that since the publication of this new package on migration by the European Commission, the migration situation of the European Union and also Polish situation has changed a little bit. European Union is currently confronted with two main migration challenges. One is already mentioned by the first speaker, the problem of instrumentalization of migration, or in other words, attempts to destabilize the situation in the European Union through forced migration. this is the topic that you are discussing in Finland, as I realized during our lunch or during the first intervention. But Poland is actually dealing with this problem since the last year on its border. Although the situation was somehow overshadowed by the Ukrainian crisis, it's still there. It's still not stable, or although better than the last year. So here, if we ask this question about the unity or differentiation in the European migration, I would say that Poland as a country and all the countries affected by this problem of instrumentalization of migration could feel the unity of the European response. As a European Union institutions and decision makers many times expressed this feeling of solidarity and also applied some legal changes that could make frontline countries feel better or better protected by the European Union as such. Although in October 2021, 12 ministers of interiors actually asked the European Commission for a possibility to build the physical barriers at the borders and didn't get a green light for this kind of action. In fact, European Commission agreed to implement some legal changes to the Schengen system to allow for limiting the access for asylum for people who use force, for example, by crossing the border, or in the case of instrumentalization of migration. And European Union is actually working currently on a wider Schengen package, which includes this proposal for regulation on counteracting instrumentalization in the areas of migration and asylum policy. And the second crisis that we are actually confronted with is the refugee crisis from Ukraine. Russian invasion on Ukraine forced people to flee their houses in search of safe haven in Europe. More than 6 million people have fled Ukraine. And European Union also expressed its solidarity by activating the Temporary Protection Directive. And this very open European attitude towards accepting refugees contrast with the skepticism that we could see in 2015. But the question that we are confronted now with is we are able to use this tool as a EU response for future migration crises, to offer protection that we have under Temporary Protection Directive to other groups of refugees that will in the future ask for asylum. And I have some doubts about it. I don't think that this is something what we can replace. First thing is legal basis. Ukraine is visa-free country, so Ukrainians could enter the European territory anyway before the war and had an access to free movement for 3 months under the free visa regime. So it was somehow easier to accept that they move anyway inside the European Union and can in fact apply for asylum in every EU country. So it was more technical actually to offer them this easiest way to apply for protection by offering the temporary directive. As we could see in 2015, it was not so obvious to accept the free movement of other nationalities. Moreover, it became a field of conflict between member states, and many member states decided, in fact, to close borders to prevent secondary movements. That's why I'm not sure we can treat this tool as a pattern for future crises. Rather not. So here I don't see this unity, or at least I don't see that we can use it as a pattern. But this crisis somehow changed the narrative about solidarity and the perception of migration as such. This crisis shows that every country can be affected by migration crisis. So in this sense, it may enable to build this consensus on the future challenges and build a pattern that we will use in a refugee crises of the future. Although I want to stress that the Polish perception didn't change, the Polish government perception didn't change so much, as the Polish government still rejects the idea of relocation. I mean, government appreciates the temporary directive and the idea that refugees can freely move and choose the country where they apply for asylum, but rejects the idea that Commission would drive the system and force people to live in this particular country or that particular country. In my opinion, it's related to the general approach towards European integration and the involvement of EU institutions into the fields of European policy. So the government's approach is generally that we should do it by ourselves if we can do it better than to transfer new competences to the European Commission. I don't know if you catch the sense of this, but this is, I think, very, very important in this to understand the sense, the general sense of this perception. As I was asked also by organizers to say a little bit about Polish perspective and the crisis in Poland, I want to say that my feeling is that the situation is better than many people could expect. It's much better than at the beginning of the crisis, although more than 3 million people came to Poland. It's estimated that 1.3 million stayed in Poland, so it's like 50% already moved to other member states, to US, to Canada, but all came back to Ukraine. It's good to mention that many people come back to Ukraine and come back again, so they are rotating sometimes. So it's really very difficult to estimate how many people we really have in Poland, although we created a system of registration with special identity number, which gives us access to social benefits and access to the market and so on and so on. And 1.1 million people already registered in the system. 120,000 already found a job in Poland. Not very much, but it's a short time. But the one thing I want to raise is that it will not be so obvious that even if we have very good situation on the Polish labor market, we will be able to absorb this migration, as we are hosting mainly women with children, with many children very often. So it's not so obvious that they will adapt to the market needs. This is something that experts on labor markets stress very often. That's why we need money for social spending, for preparing our educational system, as 50% almost of refugees are kids, to prepare them and adopt to the to education system, and so on and so on. That's why Poland appreciates temporary directive and this tool and this sign of solidarity, but is also asking European Union for money, because we are having this long-term challenge of adopting and integrating people to our system, and without money it will be extremely difficult, as the country has not such a huge experience, so to say, with migration and especially with refugees. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jolanta Simanska. That was very interesting to also hear from the Polish perspective on this situation and about the Polish view on European responsibility sharing and relocation, for example. And I think it will be very interesting to hear also the views of Anna-Kaisa Hiltunen on this perspective. She works as a special advisor on communications at the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, and has also co-authored the state-awarded book on the European Union's asylum policies. So Anna-Kaisa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Saila. Thank you for inviting me, having me with, and thank you to all the excellent speakers so far for your contributions. My comment starts from kind of comparing what happened and is happening now regarding the crisis in Ukraine and the refugees from Ukraine, and looking back a little bit to 2015-16, the crisis that we at that point had with people who came in, and my question to ask is why, what might have been the factors that led to the fact that the TPD, the Temporary Protection Directive, was not activated at that point, but was activated this time around. First of all, let's go through a little bit about what the directive actually means. It states that it can be activated, or it can sort of concern people who come as a mass influx. There's a mass influx of displaced people from a specific country or geographical area that come, whether their arrival is aided or spontaneous. So I would state that it's important to realize that a specific country or geographical area is mentioned in the directive, as well as the mass influx. These would be two important points. So this year, the political choice was made to activate that. But like I said before, it was not. So let's look a little bit back, and I hope not to repeat too many points that my colleagues already mentioned. First of all, who's on the move? Who was on the move right now? Obviously, Ukrainian nationals are mostly on the move out of Ukraine towards the EU. Over 6 million people have left the country. And like we heard, Poland has been the biggest receiving country so far. The people have been mostly women, children, and elderly people. And even if it might be a little sort of provocative to mention this, they are mostly white European Christians. And obviously, like we know, this situation happened all of a sudden. We were not able to prepare ourselves for at least this big of an influx of people. This has been the biggest and fastest moving refugee situation since the Second World War. And I think it's also important, like Jolanta mentioned, Ukrainians were already, before the war, allowed to come into the EU visa-free and move on in the Schengen area. So it was maybe easier to accept that now they come as refugees and we need to help them. Also, I think important is the nature of the conflict. There's obviously a clear aggressor and a clear victim, as we see. And we take Ukraine, we think of Ukraine as a European country. The people are Europeans. We need to help them. We need to help the country. So this sort of threat might potentially extend to all of us. And like some of the speakers already mentioned, this obviously arises a lot of emotions in us. It touches us deeply because it also corresponds to the sense of what conflict is about that many of us might even remember. And also the nature of the situation in the respect that there is no country in between Ukraine and Poland, for instance. So there is no safe country that we can say should keep these people in their area. So we're directly next to where the people are fleeing from. So obviously the discourse in Europe has been, like I mentioned, very much in the lines of our European neighbors need help, we shall give that help, and the potential threat might be directed to all of us. And this is also reflected in the Council implementation decision when the TPD was activated. And since I've been looking at, in my book that Saila mentioned, at the history of EU's asylum policies, this is also sort of a discourse that can be recognized from before. During the Cold War, it was easy for the political West, Western European countries to accept asylum seekers, refugees from the Eastern Bloc, because it was the morally right thing to do. And here I think it somewhat reminds me of that's happening now. And then obviously, like we heard, the EU response has been very unified, very historical, and these people have been accepted as war refugees, meaning that they did not have to seek asylum and did not have to, or do not have to prove individual causes for persecution. So then if we go back to what happened in 2015, let us look again at who was on the move. There were over 1.2 million first-time asylum seekers who came to the EU, but there were many different groups of people on the move. In 2015, Syrians were the biggest group, nationality group. Afghans and Iraqis were the second biggest and third biggest groups. And especially if you look at Syrians on the move at that point, or that time, Syrians obviously left from Syria itself because the conflict had been aggravated. It was more severe. People needed to come out and seek for safety. But Syrians also started moving towards Europe from Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, neighboring countries, who already were hosting millions and millions of Syrians at that point. I would, in my comment, like to push back a little bit against what my colleague from Frontex said, that people did not flee directly to safety. People did flee to safety from Syria and even from the other countries that they may have been they had already fled to. My analysis and research tells me that they started moving from there because their living conditions and prospects for a humane life and kind of living their lives forward were not very good in those countries. So they kind of had to choose from two evils, either to stay and not have good prospects or any prospects, or try to cross the Mediterranean and take great risks in trying to flee towards safety in Europe. Again, gender balance, good to keep in mind. There were more men at that point on the EU level than women. And again, a little provocatively, these were not mainly white European Christians, obviously, who came in. Also, the development of the situation regarding Syrian asylum seekers, the numbers had already been going up before 2015. So it wasn't as big of a surprise as the refugee crisis that we're now seeing from Ukraine. And also regarding the nature of the conflict, I would argue that for us Europeans, the conflicts in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq are a lot more difficult to grasp, get our heads around, compared to what we now see in Ukraine, where it's very clear to us. And we've sort of seen that before, whereas the other conflicts are not as familiar to us. So based on all these factors, the discourse in Europe was, again, in the lines of why actually are all these people here? We had the Dublin regulation in place and still do, meaning that the first point of entry would be the country that is responsible. Already there was a question of why are all these people here? They're coming in irregularly. Why can't they just stay in Turkey, for instance? And then when they were able to move across Europe towards different countries, for instance, in Finland, again, very much a question of why did they come all the way here? So sort of a repetition again, when I look back at my analysis of attitudes that we've seen before, when already, say, in the 80s, when Sri Lankan refugees started coming in towards Europe. Again, the same question of why can't they stay closer to where they left from? So again, nothing new in that sense. And yes, so EU response was not unified. We saw internal border closures. We saw relocations, at least on paper, not so much in practice, and also major polarization between EU countries. And eventually a deal with Turkey saying, okay, Turkey keeps Syrians who come irregularly on their side, and then the EU takes recognized refugees from Turkey. And also one more point to stress, these people were taken in as asylum seekers. So they were very much asked to prove individual persecution, unlike Ukrainians. So I leave it here. As you hear, there are and were differences between these situations, but I'm very much hoping that we ask ourselves whether this more open approach that we've now seen in practice, and it's been proven that it can work, could maybe feed into the reform of the EU's asylum policies in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna-Kaisa Hiltunen. It's nice to have you back here at FIIA and have your analysis with us here today. We will now move to our panel discussion session, and I think this podium will be moved, and I would ask all the participants, our speakers and commentators, to join me here. I would also like to remind for the people following the online version of this seminar to pose your questions on the wall, so I can read those to our excellent speakers. I will take this seat and ask maybe Inna to come here, and then maybe Jolanta and you can take Yes. And as we already heard, Kari has a very busy schedule and have a flight to catch. So I would now ask first if there are any persons who would like to pose him a question, or if there is in the audience in our online broadcast question related to Frontex. And he also said that he's happy to answer any questions you might have via email, because he have to leave. So if you come up with a question later on, you can pose it to organizers, us at FIIA, and we will forward it. But I would perhaps have one question at least for Kari, because I know that the Frontex has been very active now. Also, Frontex have new powers. It has new troops as well as equipment. And there are several Frontex operations related to the situation in Ukraine. For instance, presence in Moldova has been strengthened. So what is your kind of view on this? How much Frontex is engaged now with the situation, and where the boots are actually, and what it brings to the to address this challenge we have now with the Ukraine refugee situation?
Thank you very much. A good question. And I would say that Frontex had, from the beginning, as I mentioned, that we had, and you mentioned it, that we had operation, certain level of operation going on the eastern land border as a regular border control support to the member states. And then when this crisis came, then the neighbors, Ukrainian neighbors, asking Frontex help. Just the simple, it was not so much on border control, it was just the manpower to help the local authorities to manage these crowds. Because, and then especially then when this Temporary Protection Directive were implemented, and they were not border control measures done to these people. It was just more like a very much of logistical and technical equipment support what we could provide. And the second part, which I briefly mentioned there, was that of course we saw from the beginning that it's not only this control of these crowds who are coming, that the criminal networks were immediately active, because this is a golden opportunity for them, if I can say so, that they were there. And that what we tried to do, that within the mandate of our agency, that there is such we made immediate a list of activities that what can we do more. And one thing, such actions like we have this specialist profiles in the standing call, which you mentioned, the officers who are THP experts or other type of cross-border crime experts. We deployed them there to work with the locals, local investigative and THP units, try to identify. We have a certain handbooks for the European border guards called Vega Children, which is a handbook on how to address children on the move and the border crossing points, and especially with the idea of try to identify and safeguard them and identify potential THP victims. So we had this kind of awareness sessions to all locals and our officers who were deployed there, and they are still going on a permanent basis, together with some experts from our consultative forum, which has these fundamental rights and NGO organizations who are working with Frontex. And that was one thing. Then Europe under the Council and Europol has so-called Impact, this European multidisciplinary platform against criminal threats, which is like a network, and there are certain kind of operational activities and priorities for the few years. And we activated immediately this THP priority area with the member states participating, start sharing information and try to get the information also for the analytical purposes, that okay, what is the scale of this phenomena? Is it already how predominant? And then try to design together with Europol, who also deployed officers to work with our officers and the locals there. So there were many of this kind of support where we now where we can do more on the, let's say, the law enforcement and the border control side than just the sheer support for the member states to manage these big groups of people.
Thank you very much. And I think this is something what is very interesting if we think about the reforms that the Frontex have gone through after the 2015 situation. So it seems that those reforms have been very useful to address this situation as well, and important. And I would now like to thank you, Kari, and release you that you can catch your flight to Warsaw to your headquarters. And we will continue here with the other panelists. And also I remind you that Cecilia Verke is most likely behind my head, and I can see you there as well. And you are also part of the discussion. We now have some 20 minutes time for discussion, and there's already one question from the online audience, at least two. And I would perhaps start with the one which is specifically for our guest Jolanta Szymanska, and this relates to the possibilities to integrate the refugees from Ukraine in Poland and Polish society. And I think this question refers to the topic that we discussed already, and you addressed a little bit in longer term. Of course, some might be returning if the war ends, but situation might be with us for quite some time. So if I can have a brief answer to that question, and then we move on my list.
Yeah, so I think that there is a huge potential in integration Ukrainian refugees because of language similarities and geographical and historical connections and so on and so on. The question is if people from Ukraine will be interested in staying for a long term. I think that when I discuss with them, they usually plan to come back. As I mentioned in my short intervention, then they are sometimes even coming back for some week to check how is the situation in Ukraine and coming back. So it's quite visible that many of them just want to come back as soon as possible. But there are many, of course, who are interested in staying for longer. Not, I mean, at least now they started to realize that it will last longer than they expected at the beginning. So they try to search for a job and integrate. I think there is a potential as the situation on the market is good and Polish people generally have a positive attitude towards Ukrainians. But of course, there is a huge need to spend a lot of money for reforming, for example, educational system. If so many children from Ukraine would suddenly become the part of our system. We have our own problems as Poland with educational system. Even before the crisis, we were coping with this challenge. So now we need to make this challenge more urgent, even, I would say. Yeah, but I see this potential, and I think that there is also an interest in integrating Ukrainians.
And Minna Hulkkonen, you had a point on integration as well.
Yes, I wanted just to bring to the discussion how this integration seems to be in Finland, and we have exactly the same understanding as Jolenta expressed here, that the Ukrainians who have come to Finland, so they are not too much willing to stay for a longer term here, but they are looking for the possibilities to go back home. But that doesn't mean that we as civil servants, that we wouldn't work for the integration of the Ukrainian refugees. So of course we will work in that objective, that anybody who wants to stay in Finland is able to start to integrating to our society. The children can go to the school and the adults can go to work. But I guess that the willingness to go back to Ukraine is really something that we need to remember, and that also has a meaning why we don't have any relocation mechanisms inside the Europe. What comes to the Ukrainians, because we need to sort of respect the will of the Ukrainians, that they are not sort of willing to be relocated, to be integrated, but they are looking for possibilities to go back home.
Yes, thank you very much. And now we have one question from the audience, I saw, or two at least, and there is Astrid Tours, the first person, and then maybe we can take the second question also in the row, the gentleman on the right from me.
Well, dear friends, thank you very much for an interesting debate. I hope this is heard also. Could I ask Minna, we read the other day that there is a fear that we do not get enough of seasonal workers for the agricultural sector. And I wondered, isn't it quite easy among those 20,000 that have come here, women, you could have maybe a little bit of other conditions than the very, let's say, long hours that have been done. So what is done to, Ministry of Agriculture issued this statement that we will not get enough of seasonal workers. The second question I would ask our Jolanta, there has been some discussions of difficulties, let's say 6-7 years ago, between Ukraine and Poland, about the way history is treated in Ukraine. Have these difficulties been forgotten? You know, that you have to acknowledge some people as heroes according to the Ukrainian history. Has that been? And are Poles satisfied with the way Polish is now taught in Ukrainian, because you have had a Polish minority, especially in Western Ukraine. Are those questions forgotten? I would say. And two other things, maybe one to the Commission. If I understood her correctly, Poland is asking for 3.2 billion of additional support for the temporary protection and the integration. What will the Commission's answer be in a situation? Are there, let's say, what will the Commission's answer be to this request? And especially if Poland is not moving on the solidarity or the flexibility or whatever we call it. So Commission's answer to this request, especially if Poland is not moving.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Astrid Thors. And then another question from the gentleman.
Thank you. I'm Henri Alakylä from the Finns parliamentary group. I would like to ask about the borders of the intra-EU borders, so-called Schengen borders, versus the external European Union borders, because in 2015 we saw that thing that if the external borders were not secured enough, we saw many European Union countries shut down their own borders, and if we do shut down the external borders with so-called state of emergency. For example, Poland did this in early November. I think they passed a law that they can do illegal pushbacks. So, in other words, we are always in the state of declaration. When we do declare, okay, now we have emergency, and now we don't have. Now we have the tools, now we don't have the tools. So this whole system lives so much, and can we cope with that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now there are even more questions from the audience online, and there's also one at least from the audience here. I would now suggest that our panelists will make some notes, and then we will take all the questions in a row, and then you can answer those that you have been directed or asked to answer, and where you think that your expertise can contribute. We take the question from the back, please.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Okay, so my name is Milka Sormunen from the University of Helsinki. I'm a legal researcher. Currently researching EU's migration deals, so these informal arrangements. My first point concerns the comparison between the situation in Ukraine now and then the Syrian crisis in 2015. So this is a bit similar to what Anna-Kaisa Hiltunen said about the comparison. So indeed, there are differences between the two situations, but I would argue, and also many other researchers have argued, that there are also many similarities between the situation, and that actually it is exactly this kind of, well, the fact that white Christian people are fleeing now, that is the biggest difference that or the explanatory factor in the different response. So I would like to hear your views on this point. And then my second point concerns this instrumentalization, which is now very prominent in the discussions. So this is also something that has been researched before, that it is become some kind of trend now, but it's not a new phenomenon per se, but it's rather something that countries have used in the past as well. And then I would also argue that it's not completely an external threat, but it's also something that the EU participates in creating this by bargaining with third countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And looking at the watch, so I have to say that now we have to close the list. And I would also like to pose maybe two questions from the online audiences. I think the first one is for the Commission and perhaps also for the Ministry of Interior, which relates to the pushback policy, which is now at least in brackets argued to have taken place, and what should be done about it. And here the reference is of course the Mediterranean Sea, but also what has happened between Belarus and also Polish border. What is the view on that phenomenon known as pushback? I know that this is very much discussed here in Finland as well, as you referred, Minna. And then I have a broader question maybe for the Commission as well. This is something that might be difficult to answer, but maybe as a comment, because you mentioned, Cecilia, that the food crisis is something that we have already seen. We are already seeing some symptoms of it throughout the world. And of course, we also have climate change, which might even provide more challenges for the countries in different parts of the world. So is this Commission's migration package, what is now have been debated and discussed for a couple of years, actually up for a task when we think about the global movement of people, migration, refugee? Or is there need to start to think a new one already, also because of this food crisis and also the climate change implications? But now I would like to give the floor to our panelists once again, and maybe we would start with the Commission, because we have heard from the others more recently. Please, Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and many thanks for the questions. I will take the one first on the funding for Poland. I couldn't hear exactly all the what was said on this question, but just to say that under the first batch of funding which the Commission sent to the frontline member states, and that was the package of 3.5 billion, Poland got the highest amount of 520,000 euros. To meet already the first needs, because Poland hosts the highest number of displaced persons. This is out of a total of 17 billion, which is currently available. It's not clear at this stage whether that will be enough. What is important also to understand is that part of the money comes from our regional funds, and that allows us also then to spend money directly to municipalities. Because alongside a central or federal state level, they also have of facing huge costs. So it is important that they can also receive a direct funding from the union. We are aware of the Polish request, but it is part of a wider discussion also how to best support the frontline member states. But as I said, during the very first batch, Poland has been given the highest amount so far. On the other two questions, on the pushback policy and on whether the pact is up for the global warming. Well, first on the pushbacks, our commissioner has been very clear on that. Pushbacks are not acceptable. And she has reached out many times and probably will continue to tell those member states where this has been observed to actually investigate these claims and come up with measures if these claims are indeed being a reality on the ground. We are also working with some member states to establish, or some have already established, what we call a monitoring mechanism. That is a new element under the Pact, but we already try to use it in countries where we see problems with pushbacks. Which should be part, let's say, of the more wider oversight which the member states should have in place. And the monitoring mechanism is basically establishing an independent, let's say, body which looks into the allegations, comes with reporting, and comes with suggestions on how to prevent this in the future. And we are working closely with some member states to make this happen. But to go back to what I said initially, the pushbacks are simply not acceptable. They are clearly against what we consider to be human rights compatible. On the Pact and global warning, I think you would need a bit of predictions there, what the global warning could mean in terms of the numbers of displaced people. I think this probably requires having much more data about what the impact will mean for countries, which regions in the world, the timelines under which such displacements would unfold themselves. So I think it is difficult to give a very detailed answer on whether we are fit for future. I would not be surprised if after some time we would come to the conclusion that if the Pact is up and running, we still need changes to our systems, because the challenges are much bigger than we thought. And we are living nowadays in very fast changing societies. So I would certainly not exclude that even if we get a Pact before the end of this Commission and this European Parliament, that in a couple of years' time, when we also have a better picture of how global warming will affect living conditions in certain regions or in certain countries, that in fact this may have an impact also on migration flows towards the European Union. But it is indeed a very topical and very important question. Many thanks.
Many thanks also to Brussels and the Commission. And now we would have a brief answers from our panelists. We will start maybe in the order with Minna, and then Jolanta and Anna-Kaisa will have the last word.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the questions. First, about the seasonal workers. So what comes to the Ukrainians, so mainly they are female and 50% of people coming to Finland are children. So and we need to keep in mind that they are fleeing war. So many of them are pretty much traumatized. They are sort of in a state that probably they are not ready to start to work immediately. But there are also those who want to do that and who see that work is also part of the, to ease the everyday's life. And we work on that those who want to work, they will have the access to the labor markets in Finland. And since seasonal workers are indeed needed here. Then about the external and internal borders, and if I understood correctly the question, it was about the actions, what we can do there in cases of crisis. Well, I think that there was one good point what Jolanta said, that after these crises there is every European country has now experienced the migratory flows and the crisis, and I think that is a very good thing, because that is also a kind of a wake-up call that you need to get your legislation in order, you need to get your cooperation systems in order, you need to have the way how to exchange the information, how you coordinate yourself, like Cecilia said. So information exchange and coordination was the first questions after the Ukrainian war. So I mean, and that comes also back to the question about the borders. I guess that this is now the sort of the last minute call that we need to have a check that we have all the legislation in place, what comes also to the external borders and internal borders, because I think that now there are some member states who have actually started to implement the internal border checks because they don't have enough information about the people who are moving, and there the information exchange via the database is certainly one answer. And then about the pushback, well, there I can fully agree with the Commission. So Finland's position is very clear. We don't accept any pushbacks, and I guess that it is very, very important that we have this monitoring mechanism in place. So that will bring these problems sort of to the open discussion, and we can see what is actually happening there, and then if needed, so there will be relevant procedures for action afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Jolanta.
First, I want to refer to the question on historical issues that may undermine this integration process. I would say that this topic is not very present in the public debate currently. Probably it is more present in right-wing social media, somewhere in some bubbles, but I wouldn't say it's a very strongly present topic. If I would say what are other factors that may undermine or maybe not undermine, but disturb a little bit the integration process, is the potential economic crisis that we can face. As in Poland, we are confronted currently with high inflation rate, with very high energy prices. So the social situation of population may be more and more difficult with time, and this could become a problem as we have a lot of social spending related to the refugee situation. But historical issues, I think, will not be really crucial. It's good to mention that two-thirds of society declared in a social survey that it's involved in helping migrants. So it's a huge amount of population, and most of the people living in Warsaw somehow hosted or helped Ukrainians. So this builds relation, and this relation is stronger than the historical aspects. When it comes, I would just say a little bit about pushbacks, not about Polish situation. I don't want to refer to the Polish situation, but generally in Europe. I think that the problem with pushbacks is related to the problem of not effective return policy of the European Union. Pushbacks are perceived as an alternative for a not effective return policy. If we cannot return someone legally, because it's not possible, and the effectiveness of return policy currently in Europe is 18%. So it's not effective. So how can we expect in the long run that that countries will not use this tool as pushbacks? If we want to fix the system, we should fix the return policy. Should find a response for this challenge. If not, I think that there will be a rising acceptance among member states for pushbacks. That's the bitter conclusion.
Thank you, Jolanta. And Anna-Kaisa, maybe you can touch about the borders if you want.
Sure, I'll take that first. Thank you for the question. If I understood correctly, this also has to do with what to do in the emergency situations, what to do maybe in the situations where we see that there's instrumentalized migration. So as we know, there's now a Commission proposal regarding those kind of situations. And indeed, it is meant to be used only in emergency situations. As open democracies and as a union that is based on values and human rights law and all sorts of conventions, we obviously cannot just use those measures at any point whatsoever. It has to be regulated, and there's now a Commission proposal for that. Then I would like to say that then if this kind of situation arises, you also have to be able to make the difference between people who may indeed be in need of international protection and who may be there to seek for protection, but also between those people who may not even be there to seek asylum, but may be there to cause, destabilize the country that they're trying to get into. So definitely there has to be a way to make that distinction and to be able to offer the protection that the people may need who actually seek for asylum. And then sanctioning the third country that may be behind this kind of destabilizing effort would be also extremely important. And then I would like to touch upon the question from Milka about the possible similarities between the situations. Indeed, that is a very good point. I would start with the fact that obviously both situations had to do with armed conflict. People were indeed fleeing armed aggression and war, especially in the case of Syria, even the same aggressor that people from Ukraine are now fleeing because Russia was in Syria. And also I would argue that we could ask the question of whether indeed there was a mass influx of Syrians in 2015. It was obviously a political decision to say this was not a mass influx in the sense of the Temporary Protection Directive, whereas in 2022 this one is. Obviously the numbers are different, but since the directive itself does not foresee any numbers, it's a political decision to say how we interpret that.
Thank you, Anna-Kaisa. And now I have to apologize first that we are over time. I think this demonstrates that this may be my first takeaway, that this topic, migration, also given the refugee situation now from Ukraine, is something which really is important. And there were a lot of questions both online and also here in the audiences, and this is of course something that we should follow up, although we all know that in the Finnish security policy agenda there are now some other major issues as well, but we all know that they are also interconnected. Then my second takeaway would be then or kind of suggestion for you, our audience, to have a look at those projects, what were mentioned in the beginning, focusing on differentiated integration and the possibilities that multi-speed Europe could bring in solving some of the challenges. And of course, the situation has now changed dramatically when those projects started, but I think there is food for thought to think about that as well. And the DEES acronym here is, of course, one source for that information. And then my final point is a warm thank for our excellent speakers. I especially want to thank you, Cecilia, there online, addressing us from Brussels, because, of course, it's a little bit different situation to be there with your computer when we have the pleasure here to see each other and take part of the discussion. But your points and discussion was excellent as well. And then, of course, Minna Hulkonen, your insights and very, very quick replacement for Kirsi Pimiä. That's something that we are very delighted and have you here on the board. Jolanta, thanks you for taking the time to travel from Warsaw to Helsinki. And Anna-Kaisa, thank you again once. And now this seminar and hybrid webinar is closed. Thank you. Thank you.